Welcome to the lecture on a selection from Book 1 of Plato's Republic. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be discussing the confusion sometimes expressed when people say might makes right. We'll also be discussing a number of other confusions that unfortunately afflict people and make it difficult for them to discuss matters of ethics. These are conceptual confusions normally, and not confusions about trying to figure out where the best reasons or evidence lie, which is the correct ethical theory. These are problems that happen with our conceptual tools even before we start talking about ethics. And so the goal of this lecture is to get us clear on some of the most basic conceptual tools and the most pervasive and pernicious conceptual confusions that have led people astray when they talk about ethics. In the Republic, we hear Plato say, "Listen then," Thrasymachus said, "I proclaim that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger." Another quotation, not from Plato, that illustrates this same thought, although now assessed negatively. But now, instead of discussion and argument, brute force rises up to the rescue of the discomfited error and crushes truth and right into the dust. Might makes right, and hoary folly totters on in her mad career, escorted by armies and navies. That's Baloo. We can see in both of these quotations this thought that what's right, what's good, what's just has something to do with the amount of strength had by the person making the claims. So we'll need to dissect this quite a bit. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist. He lived from about 428 to 348 BCE. I say about there. The dates are not quite clear, and a number of different scholars have come up with similar, although conflicting dates based on different ways of calculating when Plato lived. Plato was the student of Socrates and was the teacher of Plato, and while he wasn't the first philosopher, he was the first systematic philosopher whose works have survived. We have none of the works of Socrates, and much of what we think we know about Socrates comes through Plato. Before we get into discussion of these very specific confusions that people have or conceptual errors that people make, we should talk briefly about what ethics or morality is. Ethics or morality is the study of the right and wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, the virtuous and the vicious, the fair and the unfair, the just and the unjust, from the perspective of the best overall reasons. Thus, the evidence employed by ethicists is reason and argumentation. Don't let this term perspective mislead you. All that means is that what all the best reasons eventually say, that's what is right. That's what is good. That's what is better. So just as in science, where we have to investigate the evidence, in ethics we have to investigate the evidence as well. Ethics is an investigative discipline. It's concerned with what's true in its particular domain. Just as, for example, biologists are concerned with determining what's true about particular cell functions, ethicists are concerned with determining what's true about the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, etc. And just as biologists aren't concerned with what anyone's mere opinion is, unless, of course, they're doing the history of biology, but that's more work for a historian of science rather than a biologist, ethicists are not concerned with anyone's mere opinion concerning what's right and wrong, good and bad, better and worse. The job of looking at what people's mere opinions are is the job of the anthropologist generally, sometimes the historian, sometimes the sociologist, but it's generally anthropology that investigates what people have believed about these sorts of things. So let's briefly look at this distinction between ethics and anthropology. Unfortunately, people are sometimes imprecise with their use of these terms ethics and morality, and they conflate two separate concepts under the same term. They conflate the concepts of ethical facts or truths with the concepts of mere belief about ethics. Anthropologists study what people, societies, cultures believe about whole sets of things, including ethical facts. Ethicists don't care what people believe in the same way as biologists don't care what people believe. Ethicists study what the ethical facts actually are. And so, just as we shouldn't confuse belief about scientific facts with belief about with the scientific facts themselves, we shouldn't confuse beliefs about the ethical facts with the ethical facts themselves. Ethicists deal with a property known as normativity, where scientists, anthropologists, historians, sociologists deal with a property known as descriptivity. Descriptivity and normativity are mutually exclusive properties that are possessed by declarative propositions. A declarative proposition is one that represents something as being the case, as being true. Descriptive propositions are those that express that the world is, was, or will be some particular way. A descriptive proposition is true if and only if it accurately represents the world. So, for example, if I say the cat is on the mat, that's a descriptive proposition that's true if and only if the cat actually is on the mat. It has nothing to do with what I believe about it. It's only true if it describes reality. Normative propositions, on the other hand, are those that express that the world ought to be, ought to have been in the past, or ought to be in the future some particular way. And the descriptive normative distinction is often called the is-ought distinction. So notice here that if you're talking about what particular people believe, you're discussing what is the case about their beliefs. It doesn't matter what their beliefs are about. If you're actually doing ethics or doing moral philosophy, you're not talking about what is the case. You're talking about what ought to be the case, not what people believe ought to be the case, but what actually ought to be the case from a moral perspective. Now let's start to get into a number of the conceptual distinctions that are necessary in order to do ethics or moral thought properly, ones that are often run roughshod over by people who haven't properly studied ethical or moral theory. But first, why are these conceptual distinctions important? Well, precisely because there's so much confusion about the nature and content of morality, both amongst non-philosophers, both academics and non-academics alike. You would be surprised at the number of people who have PhDs who are not philosophers, who make elementary philosophical blunders about moral concepts and confuse things about, for example, people's mere beliefs, people's claims, with what's actually ethically the case. Now, because most of us were not brought up learning to make philosophically precise distinctions regarding ethics and morality, it's easy for us to make mistakes regarding moral concepts. Now, nobody would think that if they had never been taught biology, if they had never been taught astrophysics, but had just learned some of the words, that they were thereby fluent in astrophysics or biology. But for some reason, many people think that just because they know the words good and bad, or they have particular beliefs, that thereby makes them fluent in ethics, and that if anyone attempts to give them some education on the foundations of ethical thought, ethical theory, morality, that something has gone wrong. But just because we know how to use moral terms doesn't mean that we understand what we're talking about when we use those terms. Now, there's one and only one group of experts on what moral terms mean and the distinctions between them. And those experts are philosophers. Now, I'm not saying that just because I am, of course, a philosopher. I'm saying this to stake out the proper turf for philosophy. There is no other discipline that claims to investigate issues of what's right and wrong, good and bad, just, unjust, fair, unfair, etc. It's moral philosophers who do this sort of thing. Yes, it's true that, for example, anthropologists talk about what people believe about these things, but that's not ethics. That's just a reporting on beliefs. So, insofar as we care about using this terminology correctly at all, and even people who generally say that they don't care about it, that they don't think ethics is all that important, do actually care. They've come to those conclusions based on arguments they've run about whether ethics matters or not, and usually those arguments are based on conceptual confusions. If we care at all, we need to listen to the experts on what moral concepts mean, and those experts are moral philosophers, ethicists. So let's turn to our first distinction, one that people often make confusions about. This is the distinction between morality and the law. What's morally right and what's legally permitted are not always the same thing, and what's morally wrong and what's legally interdicted are not always the same thing. Now, while we might sometimes try to base law on morality, morality is not determined by law. The direction of explanation, if morality and law have anything to do with each other at all, is that law is based on morality, never the other way around. Legislatures determine laws, but not what's right or wrong. We can see this because sometimes the law is wrong, and it promotes immorality. Think, for example, of situations in the past of legally sanctioned slavery or of denying women the right to vote. These things weren't right just because they were the law. And unless we could make a distinction between the law and morality, then we could never even hope to make moral progress with our laws. There'd be nothing to make progress with respect to because whatever was the law was just thereby moral. So think about whether you have opinions about who should be the next president or what particular laws should be upheld or struck down by the courts. If you have these opinions, then you already don't think that morality and law are the same thing. Even further, sometimes immoral behaviors are legal. Think, for example, of adultery or lying. In most cases, adultery and lying are probably not morally acceptable, but we don't thereby think, most of us, that they ought thereby to be illegal. Now, sometimes we do think that the immoral should be illegal, but the fact that we don't think that everything immoral should be illegal shows us that we think there's a distinction between law and morality. And finally, sometimes we need laws but for purely practical purposes, and the laws have really nothing to do with morality. Think, for example, about the fact that we have to set a specific day of the year as tax day in the United States, but the day that we pick just has nothing to do with what's right or wrong. The day we pick is arbitrary, it doesn't matter. Also, we have to decide which side of the road people are going to drive on. In the United States, people drive on the right side of the road. In other countries, people drive on the left side of the road. There's nothing to do with morality about which particular side you pick. It has to be arbitrary. Now, given that we know all of this, we all already know that morality and law are the same thing and we shouldn't confuse them with each other. On to another distinction. Morality versus reward and punishment. Now, it'd be nice to think that we'd always get prizes, pats on the head for doing the morally right thing, and that we'd always get punishment, slaps on the wrist for doing the morally wrong thing, but we all know that this isn't the case. Sometimes we're rewarded for acting morally, sometimes we're punished for acting immorally. However, even in the absence of a reward, our moral action doesn't lose its moral goodness. If nobody notices that you did the right thing, nobody gives you a prize for doing the right thing, that doesn't mean you didn't do the right thing. And similarly, in the absence of punishment, your immoral action doesn't thereby become morally good or stop being immoral. People who aren't caught doing the wrong thing, that doesn't make it the right thing, it just means they weren't caught. In fact, we might even worry that if people are doing things because of some promised reward or not doing things because of some threatened punishment, they're not actually doing the right thing for the right moral reasons. They're hoping to get patted on the head or trying to escape being punished. But that's not what morality is about. Morality is about doing the things that we have the best reasons to do, and only some of those reasons have anything to do with reward or punishment. On to another distinction. This is the distinction between morality and motivation. Now, sometimes we know what the right thing to do is, and we just don't want to do it. Maybe we've made a promise to a friend, and now we're feeling lazy, so you're going to pick a friend up at the airport. You just really don't want to do it. Maybe you do it anyway, but you really didn't want to. Or maybe we find ourselves engaged in gossip or lying and we find it really pleasurable, so we want to keep doing it, but we know in the back of our minds that we really shouldn't be doing this. It's not the right thing to be doing. So these are cases where what we're motivated to do is not in line with what we know is the right thing to do. Now, again, it'd be nice if our moral beliefs and our moral knowledge always lined up with our moral motivations, such that we were always motivated to do the right thing and always motivated to not do the wrong thing. In fact, we look at people whose motivation is mostly in line with the right and the wrong thing, and we think, yeah, that person's really doing it right. But for the rest of us, sometimes our motivation is just not in line with what we know we should be doing. It's just not an accurate picture of our psychology to say that what we believe about morality always lines up with how we feel like acting. Historical philosophers have made a distinction between what they call the intellect and the will. This distinction comes by a whole bunch of other names, but this is one that's particularly nice. And it just might be the case that sometimes the intellect informs us that we ought to act a particular way, but the will pulls us in a different direction. Aristotle called this akrasia, or what's translated as weakness of the will. Sometimes your will can be weak. You can want to do something, and it's just not what you know you should do. On to another distinction. This is the distinction between morality and commands or threats. As we were growing up, our parents or our guardians no doubt commanded that we do certain things. This is how they made sure that we did what they wanted us to do when we were maybe motivated to do something else, or when they needed us to do something and they just needed to demand it of us. They told us that we had to do such and such. Most of the time, these commands were also backed up with a threat of punishment, but sometimes they also came along with the claim that we ought to do that particular thing that's commanded of us because it's the right thing to do. So think sometimes our parents or guardians actually were trying to instill particular virtues in us. However, it didn't take us long to lose the childish illusion that our parents' commands were always correct. Even if our parents were trying to be correct in their moral commands all the time, they weren't. Our parents, our guardians, just like everybody else, they make mistakes. Sometimes we recognize that it wasn't actually the case that we ought to do the things that our parents told us that we had to do, and this is why we occasionally would mislead our parents. It was because we thought they were wrong about their commands, but we still didn't want to get punished, and we knew that even if we were doing the right thing, if they found out that we were doing what they told us we shouldn't, they would punish us anyway. So just because someone commands something, that doesn't make their command morally correct. If we're lucky, commands end up being commanded because of good moral reasons. But the fact that commands can sometimes be wrong, and the fact that we know this, shows that we already know that morality and commands are not the same thing, and morality and threats, similarly, are not the same thing. On to another distinction. This is the distinction that is very confusing for a lot of people, one that we have already looked at in this lecture. It's the distinction between morality and beliefs. So let's flesh out this distinction even further. As we've noted, unfortunately, people use the terms morals and ethics in a really sloppy fashion, and they sometimes use them to mean what they actually mean, which is what is actually right or wrong, good or bad, how we ought to act. But other times they use them to mean how some person or a group of people believes we ought to act. So sometimes they use these terms in their normative sense, in the correct sense. Sometimes they use them just as a description of individual psychology. Someone's beliefs about something, and so someone's moral beliefs, are that person's beliefs about morality. Those beliefs are correct or accurate or true if they accurately describe morality, and they're incorrect, false, if they don't accurately describe morality. Now, if you hear somebody say something like my morals or our morals, you can be sure that they've confused moral beliefs with morality. There's no such thing as our morals, my morals. If something is morally true, it's true. If something is morally false, it's false. There's no such thing as someone's morals, but somebody else has different morals. And we really need to make sure that we use the accurate term moral beliefs so that we avoid confusion. And there's this very particular type of confusion that manifests from conflating these two things with each other. It's led people to the clearly inaccurate conclusion that since different people have different moral beliefs, which is true, that morality changes from person to person. No, moral beliefs might change from person to person. Moral codes that are upheld by different groups might change. That doesn't mean that morality changes from person to person. Moral fact, ethical fact, the way things are in terms of how we ought to behave changes from person to person. And unfortunately, one of the main culprits of this is practicing anthropologists. They claim that moral relativism, the position that different morals affect different people, is true because the obvious and uninteresting fact that different groups of people have different moral beliefs is true. Well, different beliefs does not entail different facts. Another distinction: morality versus claims to morality. Just as people can command things about morality and they can believe things about morality, people can also make claims about what they think morality is. But also, just as people's commands can be misguided, people's beliefs can be false, people's claims regarding morality can be inaccurate. So if I just make a claim about what's morally true, I might be wrong. The fact that I say it doesn't make it right. Now, we all know this in non-moral contexts. Oftentimes people get confused about this in moral contexts. Just saying something doesn't make it true, in the same way as just believing something doesn't make it true. Now, of course, the hope is that when people make claims about what's right and wrong, that they make those claims based on the best available evidence in the form of moral reasons, preferably after having consulted with experts like moral philosophers and with other people about what the evidence regarding morality says. So moral claims should follow from morality. Sometimes they don't, but it's never the case that morality follows from moral claims. In the same way, scientific fact doesn't follow from the claims that scientists make. It's the other way around. No matter how much someone stomps their feet, pounds their fists, and yells about how what they claim about morality is correct, The only thing that makes a moral claim correct or true is whether those claims describe reality as it actually is, whether they correctly describe moral fact. So those are a whole bunch of distinctions that we need to keep clear when we're doing moral theory, when we're talking about morality. And remember that since most of us were brought up not doing philosophy, not being trained in doing moral theory, some of these distinctions might not seem all that intuitive to you at first. Now you need to resist the urge to say, well, that's not a real distinction. It's a distinction according to the experts in moral theory, who are moral philosophers, the only people qualified to talk about conceptual distinctions in terms of moral theory. So we need to keep reminding ourselves over and over again when we do moral theory, moral philosophy, of these distinctions and of the fact that these distinctions arose for good philosophical reasons. Now, that isn't to say that philosophers might not be wrong about one of these distinctions, but in order to argue against whether these are good distinctions, we need to at first understand the distinctions and not just misunderstand them, confuse them with something else, and then draw inaccurate conclusions based on not understanding the terminology. So now that we've gotten very clear on these distinctions, now that we know what philosophers say about them and the reasons why philosophers make these distinctions, let's look at this claim that we started out with, that might makes right. Almost always, this dictum is a confusion of morality with law, morality with punishment, morality with commands, morality with beliefs, or morality with claims to morality. But if it's a confusion, it's just that, a misunderstanding. If what somebody means when they say might makes right is somebody might beat you up if you don't listen to them, or the law says it, or so-and-so believes it, well, that is not what morality is. Morality is separate from all of those things. Every once in a while, however, we see somebody like Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic who actually does mean to assert that the actions of the strongest just are what's morally required or morally permissible. And again, that's not because the strongest can beat us up. They're actually drawing an equivalence between being strong and doing stuff and moral fact. However, that thesis is seriously problematic, and here is one version of the argument that Socrates in Plato's Republic gives against this claim that might makes right. Morality is not merely arbitrary. There are good reasons to do what is moral, to refrain from doing what's not moral. There's something that ties morality together. It's not just some random assortment of claims. Now, if morality is determined by the actions of the strongest, if it's true that might makes right, then either those actions are directed by some further reasons, the person who is the strongest and who's performing actions has reasons for what they're up to, or the actions aren't directed by some further reasons. The person just has no reasons for what they're doing, is just stochastically flailing about. If the actions of the strongest, the things that are supposed to determine morality, aren't directed by reasons, then morality is arbitrary. But we've already noted that morality is not arbitrary. Morality is unified in some way. Morality is a cohesive set of doctrines or rules or commands. Therefore, since morality is not merely arbitrary, and if the actions of the strongest weren't directed by further reasons, morality would be arbitrary, we can conclude that the actions of the strongest are directed by some further reasons. Strong people do things for some reason. But that just shows us that if there's some further reason why the strongest is doing what the strongest is doing, perhaps it's in the interest of the of the strongest. Perhaps it's in the interest of the kingdom that the strongest rules over, something like that. Then those further reasons, and not the actions of the strongest, are what determines the content of morality. Now, at this point, we might say, well, why should we think that what one person thinks just determines morality? That is a very good question. If that's what might makes right means, that what some person thinks just determines morality, now we might think that a confusion is upon us again. That what's going on is somebody's confusing mere belief with morality. Now, maybe there is a good reason to think that the strongest person, for some reason, is what has the good reasons that tell us about what's moral and what's not moral. We'd need to do some actual moral theory in order to figure that out at this point. But it's not just strength that brings about rightness. So let's turn finally to this relationship between morality and reasons that we've been looking at throughout the lecture. To remind you, morality is the study of the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, the virtuous and the vicious, the fair and the unfair, the just and the unjust from the perspective of reasons. Thus, the evidence that's employed by ethicists and moral philosophers is reason and argumentation. What that means for us, moral philosophers, is that morality follows from and is a manifestation of our very best, all things considered, reasons for acting. What counts as a good or bad reason is also to be determined by reasons, never by fiat. So it's reasons all the way down. Just as when we're doing science, we need to look for the best evidence, and if we're not sure whether this or that is good evidence, we can appeal to some further evidence or conception of what the project is that we're up to. We can do that in morality, reasoning about things, seeing whether the reasons we give conflict with other reasons that we've given, seeing why and whether that matters in particular cases, etc. So morality is not some supernatural thing. It's not merely doctrinal, like attached to some religion. It's not finger wagging. To do the right thing isn't to do it because you're afraid of somebody yelling at you or you're guilty. And it's not otherwise bizarre or spooky. I think a lot of us grow up because we don't understand moral philosophy, because we're not brought up learning about moral philosophy, thinking that either morality is some spooky, supernatural, doctrinal, finger-wagging thing, or else it's just whatever we think it is. But it's neither of those things. Morality is just the moral facts. It's not based on some standard that's inapplicable to us. It's based on the standards that are most applicable to us. What would end up making us the best people that we can possibly be? Now, of course, there are going to be different conceptions of what it is that makes us the best people that we can possibly be. And these different conceptions are enshrined in different moral theories. For example, Aristotle's moral theory, or Immanuel Kant's moral theory, or John Stuart Mill's moral theory. These are all based around different conceptions of what it is that we as humans should be. And if you ask, well, how could we decide whether one of those moral theories is the correct one? Well, you guessed it, we appeal to reasons again in order to try to figure that out. So once again, it's reasons all the way down. In this lecture, we've looked at this doctrine that might makes right and noticed that it's almost certainly dependent on some conceptual confusion between morality and punishment, morality and commands, morality and the law. But if it's not based on one of those confusions, it's almost certainly self-undermining and false. Quite a bit of what we've looked at in this lecture is attempting to correct confusions that many people have as they study ethics. And some of this might have felt a little bit accusatory or condemnatory, but it's not supposed to. What it's supposed to do is stop us from making very obvious errors in our ethical theorizing. And like I said, since most of us weren't brought up thinking about ethics in a systematic and philosophically and historically informed way, Some of this stuff will seem at first a little unintuitive, but remember that the best philosophical and ethical minds throughout history have thought about these things, and this is what they've come up with. If we think that some of these distinctions aren't real or good distinctions, well, we need to at least at first understand the distinctions and take them seriously, and then we can mount a serious criticism of any of the particular distinctions or ethical theories that are related to them. Thank you.